Hello and welcome to episode 6 of the Blue Values Journey podcast featuring Professor Rose Boswell, the South African Research Chair in Ocean Cultures and Heritage. My name is David, your host, and this episode is all about aesthetics and well-being. We are going to kick off with Rose speaking about aspects and examples of cultural aesthetics in Namibia.
In the case of Namibia, David, I think it's quite interesting to see how the natural environment also influences aesthetic practices and forms of consumption, or the ways in which particular goods and services are used in the community. So Namibia, as we already discussed, has a very long history of colonial rule, and it's quite fascinating to see how among the Herero people who live in the northern part of Namibia, where we did some field work in 2022, how it is there that the Herero women still wear a dress that is associated with the colonial times. It's almost like a Victorian dress, which is quite warm to wear in the heat of Namibia, because Namibia is a desert country. And yet the Herero women, traditional Herero women, still perceive that style of dress as being important and valuable to the expression of an aesthetic femininity. But of course, there are other aesthetic practices as well in Namibia. It was fascinating for our team to see the high aesthetic value placed on what we call in South Africa vellies, which are veldskoene or field shoes. They are made out of leather, often sometimes just raw leather, unpolished leather, from either kudu or other game animals that are in abundance in Namibia. And you will encounter people from all classes and all walks of life basically wearing the vellies. The vellies are a unique expression of the attachment, first of all, to the Namibian national identity, but it also expresses, I think, the unity of the peoples as a whole. So consumption of leather goods, and also of the meat that basically comes from these game animals provides a source of not only nourishment and subsistence, but also the opportunity to express aesthetic preferences. So I'll give you a quick example. In Windhoek, for instance, the capital of Namibia, you can come across something called the Bushman's Society, which is the dish that is on a skewer. It's like a kebab, and it will have 7 or so different meats on it. And these meats are either oryx, which is one of the local buck that you find there. There's kudu. There's even zebra on this skewer, as well as crocodile meat and a whole range of other meat forms. Now, it's interesting because I think when we consider that meat consumption is in some ways perceived to be against environmental sustainability, how it is that in Namibia, by consuming the local game and other animals to be found in that particular territory, there is, I think, in the language of cuisine, they speak about the equivalent of territory. They speak about something called terroir. So just as you would have a terroir for your wines, you'll have a terroir for the food that you also consume. And the Namibians express their aesthetic valuation of the various game meat by consuming it in various forms. So you would have the Bushman's Society, you would have all manner of what we call in South Africa biltong, or dried meats, which of course are excellent because if you can imagine the vastness of the Namibian territory, people have to travel for miles, and you can't necessarily carry food with you all the time. In Namibia and in South Africa, we often refer to something called padkos, or food that you would pack for your long journey. And the padkos that involves or includes biltong and dried sausages, or droewors, forms part of the sustainable consumption patterns of Namibians. In anthropology, there are two scientific words that we use when we talk about cultural practices and forms of representation, a representation of the self. We speak about diacritical markers. And diacritical markers are essentially about the manner in which you will wear your hair, any other markings that you may wish to make on the body itself, the clothing and the styling of the clothing, the aesthetic preferences that you will demonstrate in terms of your clothing choices. We also speak about value orientations. So value orientations are essentially those things which express to the world the particular value that you attach to a certain behavior or set of practices. So in Namibia, meat consumption is a big thing. And it's also, interestingly enough, I mean, we spoke about the feminist eye in an earlier episode, but the consumption of meat and the wearing of the vellies or the veldskoene, the traveling across these vast distances, and the harshness of the Namibian landscape is also, in a way, expressive of a particular form of masculinity. So in Namibia, what we found certainly is that there is a very strong expression of a particular aesthetic of masculinity. The men we would observe, for example, this is not all men, but we would observe that it's a combination of particular factors. It's the wearing of the veldskoene, it's the clothing, desert-proof clothing that people would wear, and it is the driving of particular 4x4s. It's also an expression of a capitalist ethos, but at the same time an ethos that is imbued with a dominant kind of masculinity, a hegemonic masculinity. Namibia is also described by the national population as the land of the brave. And so with that comes these aesthetic expressions or preferences for a particular form of masculinity to be expressed. What is also really interesting is that if you travel to the coast and you go to Swakopmund, that we talked about, I think, a few episodes back, in Swakopmund, there is also the legacy of German colonial cultural expression. It's in the architecture. It gives Swakopmund and Lüderitz as well, which is the southernmost town in the country. It creates this impression of a German aesthetic in those particular towns. So right along the coast, you will see buildings that go back to the early 1900s. It's a kind of a colonial aesthetic, and people travel from Europe to come and observe and experience this aesthetic, and also to consume the culture and the food that goes along with it. So in Swakopmund and Lüderitz, you will get food that is reminiscent of a German heritage. I mean, I can think off the top of my head, the Eisbein, for example, which is the pork roast, is something that you find all the time. The schnitzel, it's an expression of particular aesthetic preferences in terms of food, which people will travel for from Germany and other parts of Europe to come and consume in Namibia. Of course, these aesthetic practices are very much linked, I think, to well-being, because one of the experiences of most migrants, and we must remember that people who traveled from Europe to settle in Africa and others who have traveled from other parts of Africa to settle in Namibia, that food is a way of remembering one's cultural origins, one's cultural heritage. And in our research, we were quite interested to know how these preferences, these aesthetic preferences, these deep desires for remembering who one is, how is it affected by dispossession and relocation and those really heavy, often challenging topics. And I mentioned, I think in a previous episode, that for the people known as the Topenau people, indigenous people of Namibia that were forcibly relocated from Walfish Bay to Gobabeb, they lost access to fish. And so they had to build an entire new food repertoire that was centered on this plant called the Ngara plant, which could be found in the desert. They produced the equivalent of nuts, basically, from the seeds. They roasted the seeds of a Ngara plant to produce a kind of a snack They would make ice cream from the Ngara plant. They would eat it as a fruit. Essentially, the Ngara plant has become and became a central part of their subsistence in the Gobabeb community. Now, to lose access to fish is also, for us who are doing work on ocean cultures and heritage, we have seen that loss of access does affect well-being, because it means that people then have to consume food that is essentially not part of their history and of their childhood. Certainly in South Africa, we picked up on that in the research that we were doing in and around Port Alfred, which is in the Eastern Cape province of South Africa. We saw an example of that, where people who were saying that now we are forced to eat rice. We are forced to eat maize meal or pap, because we are no longer being able to access the ocean in the way that we used to. In Namibia, we found that the San communities, especially further inland, I'm moving you across the country in various ways, but further inland in Tsumeb and Tsinsibis, where the hunting and the choice of particular forms of food would provide not only physical well-being, so it's not just for the body, but also spiritual well-being. They would hunt unusual, quote unquote, unusual animals, your pangolin and anteaters and animals like that, not just because they are lovely things to potentially consume, but because they have medicinal powers, they have spiritual powers, that when you consume this particular species, it can produce a form of spiritual well-being, which was still unfolding in the stories that we're collecting. Naturally, these preferences, aesthetic preferences, can also lead to global obsessions. And we know, for example, that in Namibia, there are many examples of poaching of people who are specifically looking for animals like the pangolin, etc., because it is believed that if you do consume these particular species, that you will obtain, whether it's physiological well-being, improved libido, or whatever, healing from hard-to-cure illnesses. But what is not, I think, understood often is that it's not just about eating something that is thought to have these kinds of spiritual powers, but that you have to consume it in a ritually meaningful context. And that's where the anthropology of it comes in as well. Because when we consider aesthetics in clothing, the consumption of food patterns, even the kind of dress that people wear, markings, diacritical markers, markings that are made on the body, we need to understand them in context. What is the symbolic power of the markings that have been made? You can't just have a situation of, I think everywhere now on social media, people speak about cultural appropriation. You can't just take a particular symbol and engrave your body with that symbol without knowing what the meaning of that is in the context where it was first originating. So this is why anthropology, we talk about aesthetics being culturally determined to a certain extent, influenced. But even though we acknowledge that there are social flows, globalizations that influence the ways in which local communities will appropriate and transform these particular symbols for personal use.
Thank you, Rose. Let's imagine that you've just given all of that information to a group of people in government who are looking for something actionable from that information. What would you tell them that they could do? What would you like them to take away from what you've just said in terms of an actionable point?
I think this information is valuable in the sense that we need to understand that there isn't just territorial diversity, but that there is also aesthetic and social value diversity in any country. We are experiencing the huge challenge of climate change. I don't think anyone is fooled that it's on its way still. We know that it is here. And part of that involves understanding that one needs to diversify one's consumption patterns and one's aesthetic valuations. It may mean, in the modern Western society, it may mean downgrading what we have become used to, not wearing export clothing, using local products, sourcing our food from the terroir, which is the community that is closest to us if such food sources are available, experimenting with our palate and eating a greater diversity of food so that we do not put pressure on certain species. Understanding, for example, that consumption trends are not necessarily good for sustainability. The government has a national development plan. From that flow particular goals and targets in respect of human development, in respect of health. And it would be interesting and valuable to consider that we can get our food sources from a local or a regional context, as opposed to basically always having to import things which are perceived to be of higher social and aesthetic value. It will advance what I think the Convention on Biodiversity and the new biodiversity framework, I think it's called the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Framework, is promoting, which is to understand the powerful connection between biodiversity and cultural diversity. If we give space to cultural diversity and we promote it and we support it, it is quite possible that we will also produce and help to support a more biodiverse world. So not all the solutions, in my view, to the kinds of crises that we're facing in this century, not all of them can be solved by attending to some of the macroeconomic, macropolitical, macrosocial issues. I think that we can look at local practices and we can seek to change some of those. And we might see some pleasant changes in the society. We certainly saw some of that in the Namibian context, the diversity of the palate and the sourcing from the local context.
Rose, you told me when we weren't recording yet that today, January the 24th, 2024, is the UNESCO Day in recognition of people of African descent. With that in mind, what would you say to Namibian people?
Namibia has a beautiful set of aesthetic practices that is very close to nature in many instances. We see it among the Ovahimba women in northern Namibia that use ochre to protect their skin from the harsh sun. And their skin is absolutely beautiful. And that valuation of the cultural practice and the representation of that culture, I think, is something unique and should be maintained in Namibia. Similarly, we see the wearing of the pelts, different pelts, the oryx and the kudu, and in the Khoi and the San chief, the Nama chiefs, their headdress. I really love the fact that there is a powerful celebration of the African identities of the Namibian people. Namibia is not just the land of the brave, it's also a land of extraordinary cultural diversity that has much to offer Southern Africa and the world. So I would say, fantastic, well done. I really appreciate some of the things that we've seen.